Hey there, Barry's bringing you another Grandmaster support guide, this time with Morgana. I had to do some testing with some of these runes in the background that you avoid 20 minutes of testing. Just wanted to make sure everything in this was correct. If you're new to these type of guides that I do, then I've done some for almost every support champion now for League of Legends. We go through basically the runes, the items, the skill order, what the abilities do, and any advanced moves that a champion may have. Morgana doesn't really have anything fancy to her, so that kind of topic is kind of null for this one. But hopefully, if you are new to Morgana or not new to the support role, this can give you an idea of what Morgana does. So at the moment, as of 10.13, Guardian, even though it has received some changes, is still the best thing on Morgana. Airy build is okay if you really wish to go down that route, but at the moment I think Guardian just about scrapes through. So you got the Guardian buff, and then that will also help when you're like shielding someone with one of your abilities, and that will proc off once the threshold damage comes through. And that works with your Revitalize. Revitalize lower down there in the resolve tree at the bottom. Done some testing on that, and that does work with Black Shield. That would also work with your Guardian as well. So some interactions there with Revitalize with some of your kit. In terms of the other secondary options here in the resolve tree, Font of Life is okay. It's not particularly amazing. It can be okay if you have an Ardent Sensor on the Morgana, as Ardent Sensor can get procced through Font of Life. We can talk about that a little bit later in the item section. Otherwise, you can do something like Demolish to help take down the turrets. That can be useful if you're playing with an AD carry that does a lot of harassment, and you're more likely to be near the turret to be able to get an extra plating off. But Font of Life is generally a safe pick here. Bone Plating is pretty useful because you'll be going into close range once you've got your ultimate. Bone Plating is pretty much the best option here. If you're against like a double siege team, like a double poke, then Second Wind will be better generally because you'll just be taking the odd random bits of damage. Like if you're against an Ezreal, the Second Wind can help top your health up a little bit. And the secondary options, the Inspiration is mandatory. You definitely need the perfect timing stopwatch on Morgana, as Zhonya's is what you're going to be basically rushing towards as your first item, as your ultimate, as mentioned, does require you to go into melee range often. And then Biscuits is here just to give you some mana regen through that laning phase, because you have nothing else here in terms of like mana flow band or anything like that. So Biscuits will be the main and only way of you getting mana through that laning phase. In terms of the stat runes here, just change this to magic resistance if you need to, depending on what you're playing against bot side, but everything else here, the double adaptive force here, is fine. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be going into the training tool, and we'll talk about the summoners while we load in. So summoners wise on Morgana, 90% of the time you definitely will be taking Flash 100% of the time, and then Ignite about 90% of the time. You have decent kill potential if you do land your ability in the laning phase, the binding. You can play it with Exhauster if you want to be more on the defensive side. It's unlikely that you'll want heal, even though it does work with your Revitalize. So you will usually be Ignite, and then Exhaust is like the other 10% of the time, depending if you're scared of assassins. So into game here, I'm just gonna toggle off a couple of settings that I probably should have done earlier. But there we go. So we're going to just talk about items first on Morgana. Gonna give myself lots of gold here. So Morgana has a very strict build order in terms of the various first couple of items that you pick up on her. You're generally going to want to do Spell Thief first. You can harass pretty easily anyway with the Spell Thief in terms of the gold generation. Relic Shield is unnecessary. So Spell Thief's Edge will be for your first item with the 2 potions. And then you're going to be looking towards juggling between Boots and Zhonya's for the game. So if you can feel like you can roam around the map a lot, try and grab a Moby Boots pretty early to get around to mid and with your jungle. If you're playing against a very physical damage team composition, then Ninja Tabi will work out the best. As mentioned before, you're going to be in melee range a lot, and you are going to be having to do somewhat of a tank approach here. It's just the unfortunate side of Morgana's ultimate, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. You can always do merch res against CC and magic heavy team compositions. I wouldn't advise you to necessarily pick Morgana against a lot of magic damage though, because one of her key abilities, Black Shield, will get popped off extremely quickly. So you shouldn't be in a situation anyway. But if you are finding yourself against a lot of CC and magic damage, then well, just CC in general, but if there's also magic damage on the enemy team, then merch treads will be the necessary option there too. So let's just assume that there's a lot of physical damage on an enemy team. That's kind of where Morgana shines in that regard. The Black Shield, later, I'll mention that later, but will stay on longer against heavy physical damage teams. So from this point on, you'll be basically rushing towards his Sonya's, which is a pretty expensive item. Unfortunately, I can't sell that stopwatch in my inventory, but this is what you're going to be looking like in terms of mid game. The Zonyas and some boots and maybe a couple of control wards. From this point on, it's very difficult to suggest what you should go. It just depends on terms of team composition at this point. If you got an 80 carry with lots of auto attacks, you can go Ardent Sensor because that will work with your Font of Life. So if you land a binding or a stun onto an enemy, it will put the Font of Life debuff on them, and then anyone that hits them will technically get healed by just tapping on them, which will then give them the Ardent Sensor buff, which will increase their auto attack speed. So there's a nice little interaction with that as well. I know off topic slightly, but Zillion players sometimes take Font of Life for this reason as well, just so that they can get the Ardent Sensor for their ally. That's a fine option too. That also works with when you Black Shield someone. When you shield an ally, you'll proc the Ardent over to them as well. So Ardent Sensor is a common second option. Also the movement speed helps you get in, and the Forbidden Idol will also scale up your Black Shield a little bit. So overall this item is pretty solid. If you don't have an auto attacking champion on your team though, the other two options I would recommend are either Redemption or Zeke's. Zeke's will make you a bit more tanky. It gives you a tiny bit of cooldown reduction as well. You will also be going into melee range. So as soon as you pop your ulti, and if you've got that Zeke's activated onto an ally nearby, you'll be able to slow down the enemy as well. So that's generally a pretty nice item to have. If you don't go Zeke's, then the Redemption is more of like a backline Morgana where you're not finding any opportunities to go in. So Redemption is like, if you can't go in and do ultis and you don't have an auto attacking champion on your team, that's basically like the last option. And then you can feel, if the game's still going on at this point with your Zonyas and the Redemption, and with all your control odds, this is like a really expensive build as it is, then just fill up your other slot with either the Ardent Sensor or the Zeke's, and that will be it for you. You can pick up potions for the Elixir of Sorcery through the mid to late game around like the Baron buffs and things like that, but those are the three kind of core items that you're looking for in your game. Wish I could sell that stopwatch, but the Redemption, Zeke's, and Ardent, you have to choose basically between one of those. Right, we'll talk about the abilities now. Morgana is a very easy champion to understand. There's not a lot coming into the champion. It's pretty basic.
I am your darkness. I am your
And allied dummy there, and we'll get rid of the minions here just so that they don't cause us any interruptions. Okay, so Morgana's passive is whenever she lands abilities on champions or large monsters. So by large monsters, that includes kind of minions, that includes red buff, blue buff, dragon, and herald, and baron. You get healing when you land your abilities. Honestly, this is nothing really to go crazy about. It's pretty bad. I think it's meant to be more for a jungle Morgana, which sometimes sees some play, but this passive is pretty effectively almost useless for a Morgana player. But you know, when you'll be doing damage to some enemy champions, some of that healing will work with your Revitalize, and it might lead to something potentially. So the main ability that you'll be using during the laning phase to harass the enemy and make kills is your binding. Hits one target, it can be blocked by minions, so you need to find a very narrow corridor where your binding is just going to go through. If it does land though, it lasts a really long time. Max binding is 3 seconds, and the root duration of that is one of the longest in the entire game, and the base damage is pretty decent as well, sitting at 300 on base, and the AP ratios are okay. So when you're landing at that binding, if you're hitting a champion, though, also you get slightly healed from that from your passive. It works pretty nicely. Say if you're playing with a Caitlyn has, or any other champion AD wise or AP wise, that has a crowd control over the top. So if you land your binding, then your Caitlyn, for example, can then put a trap under the binding, and then it can increase the root duration, the CC duration of that for much longer, and can lead out for some very easy kills on some squishy champions on the bot lane. So if you're playing against an enchanter and you blend that binding and you got someone else like a Jhin or a Caitlyn that can follow up CC that way, then you can get them caught out pretty quickly and snowball through that way. Like landing a binding early in the laning phase as well will help get your jungler in too. The W Tormented Shadow is... There are some builds out there that like putting a few points in this early, but I don't recommend it at all. I think this should be left at 1 point until later on. This is the ability you should be maxing last. So your W, your Tormented Shadow, will basically do very minor tick damage to the enemy. If you're running like a mana flow band kind of build and you're struggling to get any bindings connected, you'll be like using this ability whenever your mana flow band is ready to get mana. In the case for Morgana, you're kind of only really using this to get the occasional spell thief edge stack. So that's the main reason why like you'd want to use it. If you use this on a cannon minion, it gives you reduced cooldown on per tick. So every time it hits a champion, or if it hits a cannon minion in the wave, the cooldown on this Tormented Shadow comes down a tiny bit. It's nothing crazy, but the damage isn't anything to go crazy about. But a basic combo would be you land your binding, and then you do your Tormented Shadow. The Tormented Shadow does more damage to the person when they are low on HP. So if they're maximum HP, this Tormented Shadow per tick is not going to do any damage at all. Then you've got your Black Shield. This is the main reason why you'd be taking Morgana for the entire game. You can use this on yourself as a self-cast, or you can use it on an ally. This, as mentioned before, works with the Revitalize that you have. So the thing with Black Shield is that especially early in the laning phase, the cooldown on that is really long. It's around about 20 seconds. So until you got more points into your E and you've got more cooldown reduction, you'll be using this ability only for very big CC effects. So say for example to block a Zyra root, or any form of stun or hard engage, an Ash arrow, something like that to that effect. Because if you use your Black Shield early, you see this purple bar here, it will only block magic damage. Once that magic damage, say if this person here takes a ton of magic damage and then the main CC comes through, once that shield is popped, it won't block any crowd control effects. So that's basically the power of Black Shield. It blocks all magic damage and crowd control until that shield gets popped off. Now, if you're playing against a heavy physical damage team, that shield will last longer because that team will have just less magic damage. So that shield, they'll lose their main HP because it's only blocking the magic damage. So they will lose main HP, but they will be immune to CC for the entire time until that shield is either dropped off naturally or actually popped off via magic damage. So that's why this ability is really good against physical damage. Like if you know Vi, for example, if you are against a Vi jungle, that will just, she'll be able to ult in and you'll be able to do damage. She'll be able to do damage to the target because it's physical damage, but the shield will stay on and the ally will be able to walk away from that. So that's why it's just particularly powerful against physical damage. It just doesn't block the damage itself, but it blocks the CC, the crowd control. And that's the big thing about it. Now, the ultimate, the most controversial thing about her is a melee range ability, and it spawns chains out to enemy champions. It does initial damage, and then if you manage to stay in range of the enemy, it does damage again and then stun them. But the delay on that is quite long, and it requires quite a tight range. If you do manage to land a shackle, one of these, on an enemy champion, you do get bonus movement speed when you're going towards them. So it helps you catch up slightly. So if you do it like near max range, you can get quite close to them. Especially on the later levels, it speeds it up a little bit more. The main reason why this is an issue is because Morgana is generally pretty squishy. So what you would need to do is self-cast Black Shield. In the ideal way, you would self-cast Black Shield, you would flash in, ulti, and if you start getting yourself in a bad position, then you would want to Zhonya's to stasis yourself to make sure that A, you don't die, and B, you can still get those chains off. I'll just show here so that you can actually Zhonya still while that effect is going off, and the stun still goes off even if you are stasis. So that's the reason why you want to rush the Zhonya's, for that, just that very reason. You can, it's quite nice for tower dives if the enemies are crowded around objectives. Obviously, the more targets you can hit, the more value it gets. But Morgana is a very squishy champion. She is only slightly tankier than some of the enchanters. So going in to a full team of 5 and pulling that off, it is very difficult. Ideally, you would want another crowd control AoE effect to line up with that, so that you could chain that off nicely. But the base damages on it are nice. It's just very difficult to get that second portion stun off. So in a fight, it's not uncommon to say you call out the AD carry, you back shield yourself in, you flash, and then you just try and do whatever you can. And now you're staying alive, and then you're just trying to stun as many people as you get in, as you can when you're doing that. Now, the point after this, though, is when it's really awkward, because you're now in a situation where your Black Shield's on cooldown, your Stasis is on cooldown, your ult's on cooldown, and you're the squishy Enchanter champion in a group of still potentially people that are alive. You're now got to try and walk away from this situation. Your binding will be off cooldown by this point, so you got to try and bind and then pull and then just try and run away. that's the most advice I can give you. The ultimate on Morgana does make her quite awkward for her to play, but she overall doesn't require much to play, if that makes sense. It's not a very high skill ceiling. The hardest thing on Morgana is just honestly black shielding allied players as the stun comes through. It's very, if your reactions are very good, then you can usually stop CC crowd control effects happening to your AD carrier or whoever at the split second when they need to. Because if you do a late black shield, then the target's going to get stunned still, and the black shield doesn't remove crowd control that's on the target already. You need to make sure you're shielding the target before the crowd control comes through. So the skill order for Morgana is basically Q max and then maxing E. So maxing your binding and then maxing your black shield. You can you'd leave your W on 1 point, but you can put some points in E early. What some people like to do is you take Q level 1, you take E level 2, W level 3, because it's still okay damage very early in the laning phase. And then you take one more point in the Q, and then you put a couple points in E just to buff up the shield value on that per point and to reduce the cooldown on that. It's not great. It's not great to leave this binding only on like 1 or 2 points very early. Try and get it to like 3 or 4 before you max out your Q. Try and find a balance in the game. It's kind of just dependent on how much magic damage is going in the laning phase, and just get a feel whether you need to put 1 or 2 more points in the black shield in order to make it last enough to block crowd control things that are coming through, if that makes sense. So some games you might only need 1 or 2 points if you're against like a lot of physical damage. Say if you're playing against like a Pike plus another AD carry that has no magic damage bot side, you can probably get away with only 1 point in E for quite some time. Whereas if you've got playing against an AP mage like a Zyra, you're gonna want 3 points in E quite early, just so that it lasts long enough to mitigate any follow-up CC coming past like the roots, like from the plant slows or the ult knock-up from Zyra, things like that. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how to level your E throughout the game. So it's not always the same every single game. Just get that feel in and work out how much magic damage is kind of gonna come out there, because at one point it's only gonna block under 100 damage early, and it will pop off pretty quickly. In terms of advanced moves here, there isn't really much to it. It's kind of kamikaze, flashing in all the time, doing your Qs to help follow up on a play, or being the one to initiate. It can be pretty awkward to play Morgana. You play quite far back at the start in the laning phase, landing mid to long range bindings. One tip in terms of the binding, being able to land any skill shot in the game, is if the closer you can get to your target, the more likely you're going to hit the unit in front of you. Also, if you've caught someone off, like for example, if we teleport over to bot lane, if I can find the teleport button, please don't make me run all the way there.
My flaws are
There
a
we
badge
go.
of honor.
One common scenario that you might find in bot lane is you can use this for any champion. A very common one is here. So if you catch out an enemy here, and they like and you know they like dancing on the spot, some players will try and copy their movement. They'll try and like dodge the ability, and then finally like kind of like move up to their turret. But if they know you're going to throw out the binding, they're kind of caught like that and they're dancing at the spot, just keep walking towards them. Don't just panic Q, because it could just miss. But if you can keep getting closer and closer towards them, you're much more likely to hit them. And basically them just forcing themselves just to dance on the spot a little bit is basically crowd control anyway, because they're not doing anything and they're kind of just stuck into that area anyway. So try not to panic. Try and always move up closer when trying to binding someone, and if they're still dancing on the spot, you're gonna basically get a guaranteed binding connection onto them now. Or if you're 6, it's gonna be an ultimate. You can do that with a lot of champions that have skill shots, because they don't know if they're trying to play it so that you don't know if they're gonna go left or right, but your mindset is just get close to them as quickly as possible.
Truth is a dark mirror.
Hopefully this Morgana guide helps you out. It covers all the basics of her. Right now I would only play her, as I mentioned, with Siege, poke, AD carries, with a crowd control follow-up, something like a Varus with his ultimate works quite nicely, and his poke, a Caitlyn, some of the AP mages work quite nicely still with her on the bot side. I'm sure there's like Jhin, there's 1 or 2 others. Jin's W, his snare works off your taunted soil, so that can be also a pretty easy setup even if you don't land your binding. But yeah, hopefully that helps you out. And if you are interested in playing any other of the support champions, then have a look at the guide playlist. I'll try and link a gameplay video from High ELO with the Morgana somewhere down below in the comment section down below as well. So take care guys, and hopefully the guide helps you out.